اوكي. لا لا مازن، مش الدائرة، انا بدي المربعة، مش هذه المخدة، مخدة ثانية مربعة. يا بالضبط، من الكنبة الثانية. Sorry, I'm telling my kid I want a cushion. He's not.
No problem. I'm eating Ben and Jerry's, bro. You can take your time.
Oh, you're lucky you. All the wrong cushions are being brought. Okay, so I have a nice, actually I have a nice PowerPoint, but I'm kind of annoyed because I had two PowerPoint. I kind of had two PowerPoints I've been building up for this topic, and I managed to spread the fawaid like equally between the two PowerPoints. So it's like I'm driving crazy because I didn't have time to, yeah, بالضبط man, الديني هذه. Shukran. I didn't have, it's not all in one, but I did my best. Okay. Ooh, that's so much nicer. Okay, so let's see here. First, so we're doing kind of Western criticism of Hadith. I'm going to try and do kind of an hour on the kind of historical development and an hour on the kind of modern or the actual Western criticism of Hadith. But to be honest, in my opinion, it's actually more important to study the historical development, and I'll tell you why. It's because the criticisms of Hadith, you could the way that they criticize Hadith, the responses, you can get that, I think, pretty well in my book chapter, and it, we can go over a little bit, but it's pretty easy to get. What's really important, I think, is more to understand why scholars have the perspective they have. Why do modern Western scholars and why do modern people think the way they do about religion and think the way they do about scripture? That's, I think, more important because it shows you the deep logic that's going on behind these arguments. And it's really only by dealing with that deep logic that you can really combat some of these criticisms. Right? You have to know what their deep assumptions are, and then you have to be able to like push back on those, if that makes sense. Okay. No, I mean, I'm saying that, by the way, I'm not saying that because I am advocating some kind of, some kind of like Muslim defensiveness about this, or some kind of, counter jihad or something. I'm arguing this because I think it's the right thing to do. I mean, I think that the Western, we'll call the Western historical critical method, it has a lot of benefits, and it's yielded a lot of utility and helped people learn and cast light on areas that were dark before. But it's also something that goes, that if used, and especially the way it's used with religion and the way it's used with Islam, it's kind of completely unchecked, and it ends up really just kind of serving and what is the word? I can't figure the word. What do you call someone who like helps, like someone has a psychological problem, you just like feed it? You're
It's called confirming the psychosis.
Yeah, but I know that one, but it's worse.
Enabling?
Like enabling, yeah. Someone's like an alcoholic, and I'm like, have another drink. That's it sort of enables. It ends up as like an enabling factor for a lot of biases. And you can see
self-serving, maybe. Self-serving, maybe.
No, enabling I think is the word I was looking for. I'm sorry, I've had a long day of teaching already. But so it becomes enabling, and you can see this when you look at things like the kind of the way, I don't know if you see, like, I get contacted by a lot of Muslims about this stuff, and one thing recently was how like there's this thesis that that like Islam started in Petra. Okay, you guys seeing my shared screen now?
Yep.
Okay. So what do you see? Is my cursor near the edge of the screen? Can you see my cursor?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So, this idea that like, that you know, I mean, Muslims talk about this. They contact me. They say, what do you think about this thesis that Islam started in Petra? And I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? And this is just idiocy, right? I mean, the idea that what you have to accept as evidence and reject as evidence to think that Islam began in Petra in Jordan, you know, is just, it really is a kind of an abuse of a lot of this scholarly method. So I want to talk about the scholarly method, where it comes from. Okay. The first thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about what's called the historical critical method. This is basically the essentially modern study of history. And it's also, because religions are seen as historical creatures, it's the modern study of religion in effect as well. Before you get to like what you could call religious studies, which is more of an anthropological approach or even psychological approach to religion. So religious studies today is more using like sociology of Emil Durkheim, I think he died in 1925, or Weber, or Freud, or later like scholars who are specifically scholars of religious studies or anthropology. So it's really like an anthropology of religion that treats religion as a kind of product of human culture that can be investigated from an anthropological perspective. Whereas the way that the study of religion really starts out as an academic field, or the critical field, is more as a historical study. So you study the historical development of religions to understand their truth. Okay. So what are the basic features of the historical critical method? And I want you to think about these and think about how they contrast to the way that Muslim scholars think about hadith and think about religion, the history of the life of the Prophet, ﷺ. And I really want you to have this, to think about this, right? I don't want you to think about one of these being right and one of these being wrong. I know that as Muslims, we think certain things are right and wrong, but I want you to think about them as, or certainly the Western approach, I want you to think about it as not something that is necessarily true and casting light on the false, but something that has its own assumptions and it is created from a very specific history because of a very specific experience with religion and with scripture in the Western Christian tradition. Okay, so the first major principle is what's called the principle of analogy. And we'll talk about where this comes from. And then the short answer is that it comes from the Greco-Roman view of the world. But basically what this says is that humans are always the same, right? They're not, one person might be smarter than another person, one person might be nicer than another person, but basically some societies might like chili, some societies might like wasabi, some societies might take showers once a day, some societies might take showers once a week, right? But those are essentially cosmetic differences that in fact, all humans are always the same, because humans are basically greedy, self-serving, self-interested, lying creatures, and that's pretty much the way they always are, right? And so David Hume, a very famous historian, philosopher, Scottish historian, philosopher, who's died in 1776. He wrote a history of England. I think he wrote a history of England, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote very important works on philosophy and epistemology, a great figure of the Enlightenment. He writes in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, extremely important treatise. He says, would you know the sentiments, inclinations, and course of life of the Greeks and Romans? Study well the temper and actions of the French and English. Mankind are so much the same in all times and places that history informs us of nothing new or strange. Its chief use is only to discover the constant and universal principles of human nature. And this is very important because the historical critical method in a lot of ways is first talked about as a philosophy of history. And we'll see that people like great historians of the Enlightenment, like Edward Gibbon, who died 1794, who writes The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 3 massive volumes, which I really recommend you reading. At least the first 2 volumes, you'll love it. It's fascinating. He praises this famous Roman historian of the early 2nd century named Tacitus. I think he died in 135 Common Era, and he says Tacitus was the first historian to apply the philosophy of history to the facts. So this idea that to be a historian really means to know how human beings work, and then just to apply that view, that test, to reports about the past. And think about how different this is from the Muslim view of history, right? Where there is a golden age. I mean, not in the sense of, the golden age of Islamic civilization, but in the idea of the time of the Prophet, right? So the Anas bin Malik, I think, narrates a hadith from the Prophet that says, لَنْ يَأْتِي عَلَيْكُمْ زَمَانٍ إِلَّا وَالَّذِي بَعْدَهُ شَرٌّ مِّنْهُ, right? No time will come across, I think it's in Sahih Bukhari, if I'm not mistaken. No time will come upon you except that the one after it is worse than it. Al-Hasan al-Basri said, كُلُّ عَامٍ وَأَنْتُمْ تَرْذَلُونَ, right? Every year passes, you're getting worse and worse, right? So the Muslim view of history, which is, by the way, the same as the kind of religious Christian view of history, is that there's this moment of contact with the divine. In the case of Christianity, it's with Jesus. In the case of Islam, it's with the time of the Salaf and the community of the Prophet in Medina. And then basically after that, things get worse and worse and worse until the end of time. So no, from the point of view of Muslims, people are not all the same, right? I mean, we might say everybody's the same except, let's say, the companions of the Prophet, but the companions of the Prophet are different. So that's a big difference. The second major principle is what's called anachronism. We talked about this earlier when we talked about the metin criticism or content criticism in Hadith. And we talked about how it's a basic principle that by the way, Muslims and modern Western or Western people in the Renaissance, the Enlightenment used, which is that if something is out of place in time, that it can't be true, right? So if you find a letter allegedly written by Abraham Lincoln saying that there will come a time when my party will be led by a guy whose hair is orange, his skin is orange, his name sounds like Bump, and you should reject him, right? We would just say this is obviously a forgery because no one knows the future. The problem is, we talked about this before, if you're dealing with prophets can have access to the unseen. And so they can tell you about the future. You can't reject that. The third is what's called the principle of dissimilarity. What this says is that if you're looking at reports from the past, then reports that seem to go against the orthodoxy or against the received opinion, against what's popular, right, are probably historically true, versus ones that support the orthodoxy. Because why would somebody make up something that's unpopular, right? So if you find a report from, let's say, there's 2 reports, right? One comes from Benjamin Franklin. This is allegedly from Benjamin Franklin in the year 1776. And it says, the taxes the British are levying on us are really not that bad. And the other one says, our tax load is unbearable. We must rebel, right? Which report do you think is true? Who's going to answer my question?
The second one.
Really? The second one?
Yep.
That is not applying the principle of dissimilarity.
As a Muslim who would believe the mainstream, you would say the second one. But if you want to apply the principle of dissimilarity, because everybody in the time of...
Are you saying Muslims just believe mainstream opinion?
No, I was trying to use your analogy that when we brought hadith.
Have some more respect for your religion.
I do.
Muslims are not like, oh my God. The Muslims are like out there being like, What is the common mainstream belief today? I don't know, something silly. But yeah, Muslims don't believe the mainstream. Muslims believe what can be authenticated. So, but the
I
point
misspoke.
is
I
that
misspoke.
all things being equal, you believe the thing that goes against the orthodoxy, because why would somebody make up an opinion that's unpopular? Now, that's a problem, right? If you come across an opinion that says, Muhammad was a liar, or Muhammad was a really wonderful person who everybody followed, Western historians would say the second opinion is obviously biased. It's created by Muslims to make Muhammad look really good. The first opinion, though, we should take seriously because, Muslim wouldn't just say that. This has to be something that really people believe. This is a historical report which has survived. Okay. What are some of the main themes of historical critical method? First is a default skepticism, presumption of skepticism and doubt towards texts in the past. So things that come out of history are prima facie doubted, especially kind of grand narratives like the truth of religion, the truth of Christianity, the truth of Islam, right? Now, of course, as we'll discuss, that's not really true because there's all sorts of grand narratives that are not doubted. So if you think about it today, when we always see these reports. Muslim women, Muslims in Iran really just want to be able to wear blue jeans and party. And everyone says that must, that's definitely true. But if you say, Muslims in Iran are actually pretty pious Muslims who like living an Islamic lifestyle, people say, I don't think that's true. That sounds like propaganda, But I mean, why is one better than the other? The first one we accept because it goes along with our grand narrative that a secularization view of history, which is that everybody who's religious really, like Footloose, they really just want to party, right? The whole world is like that town with Footloose in it. They don't want to have John Lithgow telling them they can't dance. They really just want to party, right? Anybody want to confirm this? I can't see your names. No one's going to let me know that they saw Footloose. They know what I'm talking about.
I saw the trailer for that movie back in the day, but I never went and watched it.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Second, suspicion of Orthodox narratives we kind of talked about. Oh, this is very important, right? So you hear this is the idea that religions aren't born, they grow. So the original version of religion is not the same as its later version. The orthodoxy is always a later growth. That's not the original form of the religion. 3, a belief that scholarly investigation can uncover truth. By critically investigating, critically interrogating the sources of history, we can uncover the truth of history, what really happened. And that the historian is like a scientist. The historian is like, has a lab coat on. The historian is like Sherlock Holmes, right? They are the ones who are able to carry out this task. They are above history. They're outside of history. They're objective. And of course, we know that's not true. No one's outside of history. Any questions so far? Okay, I'm just going to keep talking. If anyone has any questions, then they better pipe up because I can't see your faces because of this screen sharing thing. Okay. In order to understand the emergence of the Western historical critical method, you have to understand the Greco-Roman historical tradition and Greco-Roman culture. Okay, you have to understand this. The Renaissance isn't called the Renaissance for nothing. The Supreme Court building doesn't look like a Roman temple for nothing. Okay, the Jefferson Memorial doesn't look like a Roman temple for nothing. Okay, Western civilization, modern Western civilization, is not only a conscious but an actual regrowth and adoption of Greco-Roman worldview. This is very important. The first, some of the people that we were talking about, The father of history, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, currently known as Bodrum in Turkey. If you've ever gone to Bodrum in Turkey for a week of partying at the beach or just sun and tasty food, that's where Halicarnassus is from. That's a picture of statue of Herodotus. If you ever read his histories, it is amazing. He wrote it in Athens. It's a history of the Persian wars with the Greeks, but it's really a history of kind of the whole region of Persia and Greece. It's a fascinating book. And Egypt, Thucydides, who came along kind of a generation or two later to write the history of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which I think was from around 420 to 401. Somebody look up Peloponnesian War for me and tell me when it was. Polybius, he's a Greek historian, but he actually lives as a hostage in Rome. So after the Romans conquer Greece in the 130s BC, if I'm not mistaken, he basically is taken to Rome as a hostage, but he ends up really liking Rome, and he writes a history of Rome and its system of government. And I really recommend reading that book if you're interested. Did anyone look at the Peloponnesian War for me?
431 to 404 BC.
431 to 404 BC. Thank you very much. And Titus Livius, in England they call him Livy. He wrote a massive history of Rome, which parts of which have survived, most of which has survived, I think. And of course, Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, pronounced in Latin Cicero. Cicero means chickpea. It's kind of a stupid name, but a famous orator, statesman, philosopher, generally man about town, and that's kind of the attitude I want you to have for when you think about him. Okay, some main themes of the Greek and then the Roman study of history. First is its historization of myth. Yeah, we like to read about Greek myths, but actually Greco-Roman historians, people like Herodotus and later figures, are actually very skeptical of myths. They're very skeptical of myths. So there's a famous philosopher named Lucretius who dies, I think, around 40 BC, if I'm not mistaken. He's around the time of a little bit earlier than Julius Caesar and all those folks. And he writes a poem called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, which has been translated many times. I recommend reading it. He belongs to a school of philosophy called Epicureanism. And for what we need to worry about, when we need to care about when we talk about Epicureanism, is that they were atheists. That actually doesn't mean they don't believe in the gods, but they believe the gods are actually people like us. They're just like super long-lived and live in like another realm, but they're creatures, like they're made of matter like us. And they don't believe the gods have any concern for the world. They have zero concern for the world, right? And so he rejects things like this idea that the thunder is because the gods are angry at us. He says thunder is because of rain clouds. It has nothing to do with gods being angry at you. What are you talking about? I remember one line, he talks about the centaurs. He says, centaurs, there never were centaurs, nor could they ever have been centaurs. Everyone knows what a centaur is, right? Upper body of a man, lower body of a horse. There could never have been any such double-natured freaks, because humans and horses have such different lifespans. You know, a horse lives like 20 years, if you're lucky. Humans live, 80 years, if you're lucky. So how long does a centaur live? The lower half dies after 20 years, the upper half keeps going. The study of human nature, this is really important. The Greco-Roman view of history is cyclical. So remember we talked about this view of history where there's like a golden age and then a decline. That's not how the Greeks and the Romans viewed history. They thought time was eternal. That's why Islamic philosophers like Ibn Sina and al-Farabi get in such trouble with people like al-Ghazali, is because one of the philosophical beliefs that people like al-Farabi seem to uphold is the eternity of the world, right? The eternity of the world. They don't believe that. They just think that things go up and down. The Wheel of Fortune, it's not just a TV show. The TV show comes from a phrase which is Rota Fortunae, which means the Wheel of Fortune, which is that, sometimes the Greeks are doing well, sometimes the Persians are doing well, sometimes the Romans are doing well, sometimes the Egyptians are doing well. And it's just, everybody's got their turn on the Wheel of Fortune. And you have to understand human nature to know what happened in the past. A great example of this is Herodotus in his discussion of the Trojan War. He says, Herodotus says, Helen was never in Troy. You guys know the story of the Trojan War, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I do.
Helen was never in Troy. Tell me why, whoever just said yes, that female voice, tell me why Helen was never at Troy.
I don't know. It's a myth.
How long did the Trojan War last?
Wasn't one of the things that was supposed to be false about it that was repeated throughout, like there were different points in history where they say it could have happened?
Okay, that's later, but I'm just going to ask, the Trojan War lasted 10 years. So you're telling me the Trojans fought for 10 years instead of just giving Helen back to the guy who was actually your husband? They had a prince, Paris, who stole Helen from her husband. And then the Trojans were like, we're not giving her back. We're going to fight for 10 years. And eventually our city's going to be destroyed. Does that make any sense? Would people do that? Herodotus says people don't do that kind of thing. That's ridiculous. The Greeks were mistaken. She wasn't actually in Troy. Greco-Roman history is essentially secular. It doesn't mean it's always secular. They sometimes talk about the gods. People like Livy say that he doesn't like divine intervention or miraculous explanations, but if any civilization in the world is worthy of it, it would be Rome. So, every once in a while he'll indulge in it, but he doesn't like it. They don't like the idea of the gods getting involved in things and using that as an explanation for things. They don't like the miraculous. There's this story that appears in lots of histories, but a Greek historian and moralist named Plutarch, very famous. You've heard the name. I think he died around 114 AD. Somebody look up Plutarch. It's spelled Plutarch. Plutarch. Somebody look him up for me and tell me when he died. I can't remember. He was actually a priest at the Temple of Delphi in Greece, and he was believed in Platonic philosophy. But he describes this history when the Romans take the city of Veii in Italy, and they capture this giant statue of the goddess Juno, and the statue starts to make this lowing sound, like a cow mooing or something. And he says that's not possible. Inanimate objects don't make sounds. It's just not possible. You can't have wood make a sound like that. So it's really interesting. What's the point of history? History is, Livy says, history is the best medicine for a sick mind. History is educational. It's supposed to inspire you. It's supposed to teach you. And if you think about this, why do you go to, when you go to the bookstore, when there wasn't a pandemic, right? When you go to a bookstore, what are you reading about the past for? We read about the past to learn about the present, to learn about how to live. So really, history still is educational. The people in the past are exempla. They're examples of how to be good. They're examples of how to be bad, what to imitate, what to avoid. And finally, this idea of the historian as aloof and objective. This is very important because Polybius, that historian writing about Rome, he says that a historian needs to be able to praise his enemies and criticize his friends. Praise his enemies and criticize his friends. Historians are not cheerleaders. Historians are not supposed to be telling a triumphant narrative. They're supposed to critique when they have to, right? They're supposed to try and figure out what really happened. A good example of this is Polybius is talking about Hannibal, right? And so Hannibal, remember the Carthaginian general who was such a military genius, but then he led his army over the Alps with elephants in the winter, and of course all the elephants died except for one or two in the mountains. And Polybius says this: I don't believe this story. Why? Because supposedly Hannibal's a military genius, and only an idiot would lead a bunch of elephants and an army through the Alps during wintertime. So either he's not a military genius or he didn't do this stupid march. but you can't be both. Okay, any questions so far?
Dr. Brown, a quick question. It's more general. So how did these literatures, how is there any credibility to what we are reading? I mean, it's such a long way back.
Well, it depends. So someone like Herodotus, he's writing about the Persian wars that happened in, like 490 and 480 BC. So he's actually, just a decade or two later than that is when he's writing, right? So he's clearly like seen some documents. He's talked to people who were participants in the events. He talks to a lot of people who've traveled. And it's interesting because at some points, he actually describes things like he talks about how the Scythians, this civilization in kind of southern Russia, worship these like snake goddesses. And then a few years ago, maybe 20 years ago, so there were some archaeological excavations in that part of the world, and they actually found a Scythian burial mound with these like intertwined snakes. So we know some of the stuff he says is confirmed. And he says, for example, the Arabians, they worship a goddess called Alat. So, I mean, some stuff is corroborated by other sources. Thucydides is someone who's also like working with documents and talking to people who are describing events that he was alive for, like the Peloponnesian War. He was there during the Peloponnesian War. So he's, and by the way, these Roman historians like Tacitus and Livy, when they're talking about the founding of Rome, which allegedly happened in, what was it, like 718 BC, can't remember the exact date, but the 700s BC, he says like this is all ancient history. Like there's no way we can know that this actually happened. He says this, even for them, that was like ancient history. Okay. Okay, now what happens as Europe and the Roman Empire in Europe is Christianized is that the Abrahamic model of history takes over, right? So history isn't about the wheel of fortune just going between different people randomly. It's history, the world isn't eternal. The world is created by God, who says kun fayakun, right? In Genesis or whatever. And there's prophets who come, and then there's a moment when in Christianity, right, God sends the Logos, an emanation from himself into the world as in the person of Jesus Christ, his son, allegedly, right? And that's this moment of contact with the divine, and then everything goes downhill. So basically, there's 3 points in history that matter. There's the creation of the world, there's the fall from the Garden of Eden, Jesus comes, and there's the end of the world. Everything else is just filler matter. It's just filler material. Okay? And history is a place, the theater for the drama of this religion. Right? The miraculous and the divine is a centerpiece of history. It's a centerpiece of history. History is still a teacher. It's still full of exempla, but it's exempla for the faithful. It's not about understanding human nature or society or how things rise and fall, right? Or think about what are these early important histories written about? Herodotus, the Greek-Persian Wars. You guys watched 300? Anybody here?
Yep.
Yes.
Zack Snyder.
Yeah.
Once again, I saw the trailer but did not see the movie.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite movies. It's one of the most perfect movies I've ever seen. It's the most racist movie I've ever seen. But from a craft perspective, I just think the movie is amazing. What's really interesting is there's a lot of stuff in that movie that is taken straight out of Herodotus and straight out of Plutarch. It's very interesting. A lot of even the funny lines in the movie are actually straight out of Plutarch. Now, Why think about the idea, and even think about like what big 20th century histories are written about. World War I, history of World War II, Civil War history. People still want to write about wars. They want to write about great leaders, and they want to write about wars. Why? Because we want to know how the war happened, how a war was won, why was someone a good leader, why was someone an evil person, right? This is what we want still to this day. And that is a framework for history that is created by people like Herodotus and Thucydides. Right? They want to Herodotus says, why do we want to study the Persian War? We want to study it because we want to know how it happened, and because we want to preserve, this is another thing I didn't talk about, I didn't write in this lecture, so I'll write it down for you. Pen. Sorry for my bad handwriting. Kleos. Kleos is the great deeds. To memorize the great deeds of people in the past so they can inspire us in the present. Okay. Examples of church histories. Eusebius. These are translated in English. I recommend reading them. Ecclesiastical History of Eusebius, who's the bishop of Caesarea in Palestine. He's a close friend of Constantine, the guy who converted to Christianity, the Roman Empire. In England, Venerable Bede is History of the English People. Venerable Bede is the one who comes up with the like AD, BC AD dating system. He's a very interesting guy. You should read the History of the English People by Venerable Bede. Here's a picture of allegedly Venerable Bede. Sitting there.
Isn't that similar to what the pagan Arabs at the time of the Prophet, may peace be upon him, did when they were talking about their lineage and the great battles that their forefathers did, and those kind of great events?
Yeah, but there's a difference. So they want to preserve those deeds so that they can be inspired by them and memorialize them. But the difference is that, well, it's interesting because if you read poems like the Mu'allaqa of Zuhair bin Abi Sulma, you do get a sense. He says, woman, what is it? What is it? Man لم يعامل في كثير من أموره يدرس يوطأ بالأنياب no, what is it? يوطأ بالأنياب يدرس بالأنياب ويوطأ بالمنسم, right? So he says those people who don't conduct their affairs diplomatically, they will be ground up by the camel's teeth and crushed by its hooves. يدرس بالأنياب ويوطأ بالمنسم. That's it. So you could say that in some of the pre-Islamic poems, there is a sort of a study of what is the proper conduct that will, like, what are the rules of life? But it's not as systematic, obviously, as history because it's poetry. Okay. Renaissance. Roughly 1300 to roughly 1550, right? Obviously, these are rough dates. But what happens? Basically, the Western Europe is cut off from a lot of the Greco-Roman tradition, in part because simply like civilization kind of falls apart. I mean, really, like Western Europe, Western Roman Empire collapses, it falls apart, economy collapses, politics collapse, learning collapses, infrastructure deteriorates. They only speak Latin, so they don't know Greek. The Romans didn't really translate a lot of scientific learning into Latin. So they're cut off from their Greek heritage. The Latin heritage they have is kind of, a lot of it is lost or unappreciated. Oh, thank you so much. My wonderful wife has brought me tea. Thank you. But in the really beginning in the 1100s, they start to get material translated into Latin through Islamic Spain, through Islamic Sicily, later through the Byzantine Empire. They start to reconstitute their Latin heritage. By the 1300s, you see a revival of the historical classical Greco-Roman spirit by people like this guy, Francesco Petrarch, who died in 1374, Italian. I think he's from Florence, if I'm not mistaken. And you get a return of this sort of secular materialist view of history, and also the notion that the historian is kind of stands apart from history. The historian is no longer like St. Augustine or Eusebius or Venerable Bede, who are telling the history of Christianity. Now they're outside of that. They're outside of that narrative. They're not serving the Christian narrative anymore. They're serving the study of history per se. One of the big things that happens is becomes the awareness of historical distance. This is very important. Okay, so we look at this picture. This picture is from, I think it's from the 1500s. It's from a church in Germany, in Tübingen in Germany. What's that a picture of? Who can tell me? Anybody want to guess?
Is that the Jesus on the cross?
Well, that's actually not Jesus. That's a guy named Simon the Cyrenician, who has to carry the cross for a little bit because Jesus can't carry it anymore. But how are those people dressed? Are they dressed like Palestinian peasants? I don't know if you can see this. See this knight in the background with a spear?
They're dressed like German serfs.
Dressed like German. Right? So, I mean, what the heck, right? I mean, why are these guys? Do you ever see pictures? Yeah, I mean, why are these people dressed like German peasants? Because these people saw themselves as just direct continuities of the biblical story, right? They're not distant. The story of the Bible is just happened, right? It's just happened yesterday. They don't think, when we think about the ancient world, what is it? It's separated from us, right? We're historically distant from it. We're separated from it by what? The Middle Ages. The idea that you're not part of this continuity of Christian history anymore, but you're kind of separated from it. It's a distant past. That Greece and Rome aren't things that just happen, that they are ancient history that is really different from your time. This is an awareness that begins in the 1300s. And one of the reasons it begins is because of awareness of the change of language. The role of language, the study of languages, is so important for the historical critical method, just as it is in the modern study of history. Because people like Petrarch realized that the Latin that the medieval church was using was not the Latin of people like Cicero, of people like Livy. Like, their Latin was dirty, it was corrupt. By the way, this is the same kind of realization that someone like Muhammad Abdu in the 19th century realizes about Arabic being used by Muslim scholars in Azhar in the 19th century. He says the Arabic we use today is it's not the classical Arabic. It's sort of decadent, it's polluted, it's soft, it's inexact, it has no spirit. So they want to get back and like write like Cicero wrote, write like Livy wrote. And what that means is they start to see how texts change. Because when you know that language is changing, you can see how texts change. You can see forgery occurs. Now, earlier people like Eusebius, like Venerable Bede, right, knew about manuscript criticism. They knew that there were certain reliable manuscripts. There was an unreliable text of the Gospel of John. There was a more reliable text of the Gospel of Mark, or things like that. They knew this stuff, okay? But now there's this sense of really being able to question some age-old truths based on your confidence of your command of language. And an example of this, okay, so I just want to say, this is like anachronism in language. Two examples of this that are really important. This guy, Lorenzo Valla, I think he's from, is he from Florence or Padua? He's from Florence. He looks at, there's this important document called the Donation of Constantine, which was allegedly a document written by the Emperor Constantine before his death. I just think it was in 335 of the Common Era, right? And he allegedly gave control of almost all the lands of Italy to the Pope. This is called the donation of Constantine. Lorenzo Valla looks at this document and he says, wait a second, there's words in here that didn't exist at the time of Constantine. The word for certain unit of land, the word for certain type of crown. These words were not used at the time of Constantine. This is a later document. So he undermines this central pillar of the temporal authority of the church. And then that's in Latin. Another scholar, Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, but he lived for a time in England, he lived in France, he lived in Switzerland. Like Muslim scholars, they moved around a lot, right? Desiderius Erasmus gets the earliest, he knows Greek very well, and he collects the earliest manuscripts he can find of the New Testament, and he creates a critical edition of the New Testament. And in it, lo and behold, what does he find? But there's certain stories that are not there. Like, you guys know the story, whoever saw the Passion of the Christ or has heard of the, let him who's without sin cast the first stone? Who's heard that story?
Yeah, I've heard that one.
It's not in the original Gospels. This is a later edition. There's the one example of the one explicit discussion of the Trinity in the New Testament, which is like 1 John 5-7, which is called the Johannine comma, where it says there are three in the heavens who bear witness, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. Erasmus says this is not in the original manuscripts. It's a later edition. It's pretty controversial. Okay. Everybody with me? So the study of language and the realization of change in language makes them understand, or makes them question fundamental ideas in Christianity, both scripturally and in terms of authority. Okay, other big developments. 1492, on today. How many years ago? Was America discovered today? I don't know what the significance of this day is. It's Columbus Day, right?
Actually, up in Massachusetts here, they don't call it Columbus Day anymore. They call it Indigenous Peoples Day.
Good for them. That's what my wife's been saying to my kids all day. She's been indoctrinating them with Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'm not Italian, so I don't care. Until 1492, everybody was pretty confident about how the world was. The world, there was like, there's a map of the world. There's Europe, there's Africa, there's Asia. And then the reason you don't see more is not because they thought the earth was flat in a circle. It's because they thought it was a sphere. There was just ocean on the back. The reason you don't see the back is there's nothing there. But it turns out there is something there. And those things are called the Americas. And guess what? They're full of people. They're full of people who have never heard of Christianity or Islam or anything like that. And yet they're living happy as clams, right? So it really explodes the map. And there's this interesting thinker, he's a tutor and an intellectual in France named Isaac de la Peyrère, and he writes this book called The Pre-Adamites. And what he says is, wait a second, we're reading the Bible and the story of Genesis, it's like the history of the human race, but the Americas aren't in there. We know, okay, Noah's son Ham settles Africa, and Shem settles the Middle East and Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Well, no one talked about the Americas. So what he says is, I think the story of Genesis is just a story of one tribe. It's not about everybody. And that, by the way, he says in the story, in Genesis, after Cain kills Abel, what does Cain do? He goes off and marries from another people. But wait a second, I thought that Adam was the first person. So he actually points in the story of Genesis, this doesn't make sense. There's another scholar, Montaigne. He's a very interesting guy. He's a soldier of fortune and an intellectual from France. And for him, he's the one who starts the idea of the essay. And he has a spectacular book called The Essays. I recommend reading it if you're interested. It's translated in English. And he he just becomes incredibly skeptical. He says, like, what do we know? We thought we knew everything. We thought we knew how the world was. Now it turns out there's people who live in Brazil who don't wear any clothes and who don't follow any of our rules and yet have perfectly orderly, happy lives. So everything we thought you need to live and is true for all human beings is actually not true for all human beings. Exploding the authority of the church, the Protestant Reformation, which begins in 1517 with Martin Luther, usually it's assigned with Martin Luther's pinning his 95 Theses to the church in Wittenberg. This suddenly challenges the authority of the Catholic Church and challenges their control of the interpretation of Scripture. It breaks the shackles on interpretation of Scripture. Now, scriptural interpretation is not going to be controlled by a hierarchy anymore. It's going to be basically open season. And another thing it does, right, is one of the things that the early Protestant people like John Calvin are very skeptical of is the Catholics and all their claims of miracles. The miracles of saints, the miracles of this relic, the miracles of this, that, and the other, which they claim shows the proof or proves the truth of the Catholic leadership, of the Pope's leadership. They say you see a doctrine emerge called the notion of the cessation of miracles, that miracles really have stopped. A lot of the scriptural criticisms that people like Erasmus did are adopted by early Protestants. And some Protestants, like the Quakers, become quite critical of the Bible. They think that the biblical text is corrupt, it's not reliable in a lot of places, but that doesn't bother them because what they think is that the real truth of religion doesn't come from the Bible, it comes from the inner light that God casts in the heart of the believers. Right? So that's really where truth comes from. That's really where truth comes from. And once you think that truth comes from outside of the Bible, challenging the textual integrity, the historical reliability, the historical relevance of the Bible is suddenly possible. And now there's places where this can be done. In England in 1690s, the censorship laws lapse. You start getting a lot more permission to print and think and express yourself openly. The Dutch Republic in the 1600s is also remarkably religiously tolerant, accepting Jewish refugees from Spain and non-conformist Christians. There's a very, I think he died in 1677, actually, that's a mistake. Benedict Spinoza is someone whose family had converted to Christianity from Judaism and left Spain, fled to Amsterdam. And he writes this extremely influential work called this Theological Political Treatise, which it's been translated in English. It's a very important book to read if you're interested in the subject of the development of modern views of history and religion. What he basically says is, look, the Bible was a book written for a certain time. Like the Bible is written for its audience. Like the Bible talks about God having hands and walking in heaven and all stuff like that. And that doesn't mean it's true. That's just how its original audience thought about God. Like, but that doesn't make it binding for us. The only thing in the Bible that's binding for us is believe in God, love your neighbor, be just, respect people's property, don't hurt other people, right? Kind of basic natural law principles. And how do we know those things? We know those things through philosophy. We know those things through the Greco-Roman philosophy, which has now been revived, right? And so that now the real font of truth is outside of the Bible. And the Bible is being reduced more and more to just a historical product. It might be cool to read, it might be sometimes be inspirational, but it's not the storehouse of truth anymore. And of course, then you have the same thing that's done to the map is done to the cosmos by Copernicus and Galileo in the 1600s, where now the Earth is not the center of the cosmos anymore. It's just one of many planets orbiting the sun. And again, the challenge, it's not that somehow if the Earth orbits the sun and the sun isn't orbiting the Earth, somehow God doesn't exist. That's not the point. The point is the church had adopted and confirmed over and over again for generations the Ptolemaic Aristotelian view of the world, in which the Earth was the center of the cosmos and all the planets were rotating around the Earth in spheres, right? And it's just another example of, look, that what you thought Christianity was, as dictated by the church, turns out to be not true. We have a few more minutes, right, Yasser?
Yeah, let's break in 3 minutes, inshallah.
Okay, 3 minutes. Okay, I'll try and do this really quickly. You get a revival of that Greco-Roman notion that, you know, people, it's not just that the nature and physics works through laws, like the laws of gravity that are being discovered by Galileo and Newton and people like that in this time, but actually also history and human societies work by laws. Voltaire says this. David Hume says that in that notion of principle of analogy. So just like you can scientifically understand the movement of planets, you can pretty much understand how people act. They always act the same, right? Here's a nice picture of Voltaire, the famous French Enlightenment literateur and essayist and historian, very interesting guy, very funny guy. If you read any of his books like Candide. My favorite thing he says is, despite being attended by the best doctors in the world, he survived. All this guy is talking about, he's sick, and he's like, normally doctors would kill you. And then using textual criticism, you don't just get the kind of unraveling of the reliability of the biblical text, you get the unraveling of the reliability of the classical heritage as well. There's a German scholar named F.A. Wolf. In 1795, he does a study of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and he shows these two books are stylistically so different, they could not have been written by the same author. Right? Now, this is very important. The point I'm going to make right now is very important. 1 second, Yasser, and then we'll break, which is, it's not like earlier scholars hadn't noticed that different parts of the Bible had different literary styles. It's not like earlier scholars hadn't noticed that the Iliad and the Odyssey had different styles, okay? But they had never been allowed to think, or had allowed themselves to think, or it would never have occurred to them to think that these inconsistencies or problems would lead you to overturn something as dogmatically certain as the Bible is revelation, or Homer. There was a guy named Homer who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. So it's not just about method, it's about the attitude that goes along with that method. The attitude of confidence. And this is something I missed in the previous lecture, which I should have said, which is one of the things you see in the Renaissance that you'd never see before, as far as I know, is something called progress. Not that progress happens, but that people are aware of it. Someone like Louis Leray, in a book called Les Vicissitudes des Choses, The Vicissitude of Things, he dies in 1575. He says, we in Europe are now discovering things and understanding things that no one has ever understood or discovered before. Right? In the 1500s and the 1600s, when the great basilica at St. Peter is built, that still stands in Rome today at the Vatican, right? They take this obelisk that the Romans had brought from Egypt and erected at the center of St. Peter's. You can still see it today. And they move it like 50 meters or something like that. And they're like, no one had done this since the time of the Romans. No one had been able to do anything this mechanically sophisticated. And this was just this huge moment of back patting and saying, oh my God, the world is getting better. We know more. And think about what that idea of progress does. Think about how essential it is for our view of the world today. We believe that technology is constantly advancing. We believe that medicine is constantly advancing. Like, people believe that we're going to find a cure or some kind of cure for coronavirus. I mean, people generally believe that, right? I mean, that's actually a pretty weird thing in history. The idea that you can like find a cure for something, no way. Like, no, we don't have a cure. We just die. Like that, we have no control over life. You get cursed or something happens or a witch curses you or God doesn't like you and you die. And there's nothing you can do about it. This notion of progress is probably the most important idea that comes out of the Renaissance. Okay, take a break and we'll keep talking about this in a few minutes, inshallah. How long is the break, Aster?
Is 10 minutes good for you?
Yeah, it's fine for me.
Okay, 10 minutes is.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. You there?
السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Okay, good.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Plutarch died after 118. Plutarch death 119. Okay, thank you. All right, Q&A. Past, would you say, Anzar Latif, aren't you on, don't I know you from Facebook? I don't know, he probably can't answer, but I mean, yeah, no, I'd say that, no, I don't think that, so Tolkien's view is more of a, like a bucolic, a kind of industrial romanticization of the pre-industrial, right? So the evil isn't about the passing of time or the deterioration of morality as much as it is about the kind of the fall away from like the life of the Shire, right? That's one aspect of it. But another, I mean, I would say that there is something that you see in Tolkien, but you really see it pretty much everywhere in history, in almost, which is called the old man's view of history. And this is like, it's always true, right? So anytime you get, you know, a bunch of guys or whatever, a bunch of people who are past 30, they'll automatically start saying things like, you know, kids these days, you know, it wasn't like it when we were kids. So somehow, you know, the world is always getting worse, like, but it can't actually be true. I mean, in a way, like if things were so much worse all the time, then we would all be, you know, like just lying around in sludge and injecting ourselves with needles in the head or something like that. I'm not sure how bad things would be, but like, you know, there's a tendency for people to always sort of, especially when they get older, to look at the world when they were young as better. Sometimes it might actually be the case, but I think that a lot of times it's just a sort of a function of getting older. Recommend a reading list, pre-Islamic and Enlightenment classical works. You know, like you can look at these sort of great books things, just look at like one of those great books collections and probably read those. Okay. Let's share screen, portion of screen. There we go. Okay. So we talked about the kind of basic foundations question in the classics, same thing with the Bible. Scholars in the 1700s and 1800s start looking at the Bible and saying, hey, look, actually there's a lot of different sources in the Bible. So something like the Gospel of Mark, for example, is big chunks of the Gospel of Mark reappear in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. And then the Gospel of Luke and Matthew share commonalities that some other common source that they didn't use, right? And they see that, let's say that the book of Genesis has two different versions of the creation story that have different styles and themes. So there's like, they come up with the idea that there's two different authors of these two different stories. And so there are these, even within one book of the Bible, there's different sources that have been kind of collected together. And this leads to what's called redaction criticism. Redaction criticism means that something like the Bible goes through a process of editing. So somebody is literally, or a group of people or a tradition of people are literally sitting there and being like, okay, I'm going to take this story from here, this story from there, and I stick them together. I'm going to take this material from here, stick it over here, and this is going to be the book of Genesis, right? And those redactors, those editors, are doing this for a certain reason, right? They're trying to create a certain message. If I sit and I take clips of Sheikh Yasser talking about this topic, and I take 5 minutes from this interview he does, 5 minutes from this topic he does, 5 minutes from this topic, and then I say, look at Sheikh Yasser Kazi, right? Look at the stuff he's saying. I'm not just doing that objectively. I'm trying to create a narrative. I'm trying to create a message, an image. I'm an artist, right? I'm an author in a way. Instead of using words, I'm using snippets of material. And another thing is, so these are types of criticism that are developed in the 1700s and 1800s. Form criticism, source criticism, redaction criticism. Form criticism means looking at what are the purposes of these original parts of scripture. This was a prayer that was said in liturgy. This was a story that was told in a public gathering. This was a law that was used in society, right? So different parts of the scripture fulfill different functions. I don't know why this is not. Okay. And you get a really, like a very clear phrasing of this principle of dissimilarity by a guy named Jacob Perizonius, a Dutch scholar. And remember what the principle of dissimilarity is. The principle of dissimilarity means if something goes against the orthodoxy, it comes from before the orthodoxy, which means it's the original version. And I want you to think about this. This is very important, right? Voltaire and other people talk about how there are these other non-canonical gospels. So one of the things that Christian scholars start to discover, or Western Enlightenment scholars start to discover, is, in the Greek corpus and in the Byzantine tradition, and in the tradition of Hellenistic Judaism, there's all these other books of the Bible and even of Gospels that weren't ever canonical, but that actually tell very different stories about the children of Israel, about Jesus. And you start seeing this idea emerge that these Gospels might really be telling like an original story that's not the later orthodoxy of the official New Testament, of the 4 canonical Gospels. And one of the places you see this is in the what's sometimes called the Deist movement, right? This group of writers who mostly come from England in the 1600s and 1700s. And one of the things you see is that they have this idea that there is a God, God cares about us, he wants us to be just, but basically that God's message is not being told through Christianity, right? And one of the reasons it's not being told through Christianity is because Christianity was basically hijacked by the Roman Empire and by clergy who kind of corrupted it and made it into this human mess. And there's this one guy named Anthony Collins, who I think dies in the 1690s, if I'm not mistaken. And he writes a book called Christianity Not Mysterious. And what he says is that the real original version of Christianity was really rational and pure. And, you don't have this idea of Jesus as the Son of God. There's no Trinity. There's just the one God, right? And that's basically corrupted by Paul and by the papacy. And so you have this idea that if you can actually tell what the original documents of Christianity are, what the original parts of the Bible are, you can actually get a better idea of the original form of the religion than the later official versions of the Bible. And so by using things like the principle of dissimilarity, by saying, okay, if I have a doctrine that seems to talk about the Trinity in a very clear way, well, this must be a later document that's not originally part of Christianity, because originally Christianity wasn't Trinitarian. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
Okay. And finally, what's the thing they use to kind of measure whether stories are reliable? We talked about the principle of dissimilarity, but also the principle of analogy. We talked about that earlier. Okay. Why is this important for Orientalism and the study of Hadith? Because Western scholars basically say to themselves, okay, we've uncovered the history of our tradition. We realize that our scripture has gone through historical change. it doesn't actually reflect the true message of God. A lot of our scripture is just written for certain communities at certain times. A lot of it has been altered. A lot of it has been edited to, to fit a later orthodoxy that's not actually the original message. And so they just assume that this is the case for everybody else's traditions, right? The Western study of history, of the Western study of the other, the non-Western other, in one way, it's valuable, right? You have legitimate scholarly interests in other parts of the world and other traditions that actually helps advance knowledge, seeking the truth. On the other hand, it's also part of essentially a colonial agenda, both before colonialism and during and after colonialism, right? So someone like Voltaire, remember him, died 1778. He says in one of his books, Persians had no knowledge of Zoroaster until Western scholars studied him. The Turks had no, by that he means Muslims, the Turks had no knowledge of Mohammed until the Englishman George Sales traveled to Arabia and studied him. Okay? Think about that. So in the 1700s, someone like Voltaire is saying other people in the world really don't even understand their own religions. They're in the dark just like we were, and we can show them the light. We can show them the light. And that becomes, I don't want to say that's what justifies or what drives colonialism, but it certainly helps justify it, and it certainly facilitates it, and it certainly becomes part of colonial activities. And you see that even today with the way that people talk about, really, I call them kind of tipsy Nigel British historians who are very, very arrogant, or anybody, someone like Richard Dawkins, just the way he talks about people who believe in religion, especially from other traditions, just how they're, like they're little kind of primitives. They're savages. They're primitives who just don't understand that they just haven't come to see the world like adults do. Right? And we should help them. We should help bring them out of their darkness into the light. And it's very interesting that the study of Islam, the study of the Islamic world, most of it actually comes about as part of the colonial agenda. So the British colonization of India, starting in the, obviously in the 1600s with the British East India Company, but then really in the 1760s when they start to take real territorial and administrative control in places like Bengal and Bihar, and later on all of India, right? The study of Persian, the study of Islamic law in India, the study of Islamic history. Who are these people we're governing? British people had to learn Persian in order to deal with the Indian administration. Until the 1850s, the official language of British India was Persian. In Southeast Asia, also starting in the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company and the domination of Java and Sumatra and turning Java into a big coffee plantation, right? You have to study the local traditions. You have to study Shafi'i law. You have to learn, okay, how does Islamic law work? How does Islamic custom work? The French in North Africa after 1830, when they colonized Algeria, the study of Maliki law, the study of Sufi brotherhoods, all this stuff. When the Europeans start dealing diplomatically with the collapsing Ottoman Empire, the Eastern question, they have to have diplomatic expertise of Ottoman tradition, Ottoman culture. Now, what's interesting is that the study of Islamic origins, the Quran, the Hadith, early Islam, doesn't come through these direct colonial venues or avenues. It comes through essentially an extension of biblical studies. So the same thing we've been talking about till now, the Western study of historical critical study of the Bible and religion, the same scholars who engage in that tradition in the West, in the study of Christianity, just turn and apply the exact same lenses, the exact same critical tools to the Islamic tradition. Someone like Julius Wellhausen, a German scholar who died in 1918, he's the one who came up with that idea that there's sort of four main authors of the Old Testament or of the Torah, Y, Q, Y-E, what is it, D and P, I think Deuteronomy, priest, Yahweh, and I forget the other one. Okay, so he has this really important idea of kind of source criticism when it comes to the Bible, the Old Testament. He writes some of the earliest critical histories of Islam. Other people like Ignaz Goldziher, we'll talk about them, are similarly products of the biblical tradition. William Muir, he's actually the first guy who writes a really kind of historical critical biography of the Prophet Muhammad. He's actually worked for the British East India Company. He's an intelligence officer and an administrator during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. His brother was a scholar of Sanskrit. He's a scholar of Arabic and Persian. And he wants to criticize, come up with a critical biography of the Prophet Muhammad to in some ways disprove Muslim belief in them. He says the Hadith is a chorus of glory for the Prophet. Basically, Hadith collections like Bukhari don't really represent the words of the Prophet. They're made up later by Muslims to basically make the Prophet look good. And he says that the Muslims don't do content criticism. They just believe anything they hear about the Prophet Muhammad, basically. Ignaz Goldziher, who's a Hungarian scholar coming out of like the German academic tradition, he's an interesting guy. He actually goes and studies here's Goldziher for you. He actually goes and studies in Al-Azhar in Egypt. And in a lot of ways, you can see in his work real reliance on Muslim scholars for some of his insights. He says, like William Muir, he says, the Hadiths don't tell the story of the Prophet. They tell the story of the Muslim community during the time of the Umayyad period and the Abbasid period, right? The Hadiths are not really reflections of the Prophet's time. They're the Muslim community defining itself, getting into internal debates with itself, and using the person of the Prophet to justify or support different claims of who should rule, of what the correct understanding of law is. So if you want to say that,
Dr. Brown?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I wanted to interrupt you because I have just a small little question about this claim that they make, that it's all about, justification or legitimizing one rule or another. Most of the Hadith corpus is about stuff so mundane and like totally unrelated to political rule. How could they come up with such a conclusion? When you're talking about how to pray and,
Yeah. What Goldziher says is that they're not doing that for political purposes. They're doing that for legal purposes. So during the Abbasid period, he says that they basically create their law by creating hadiths. But your point is good. This is a very good point, which is that, like, why would someone sit around and forge, two different versions of Aisha's like hadith about the Prophet's ghusl? Like one where he washes his feet, before, he dumps like water. He doesn't wash his feet. He washes his feet before he washes his body, and one where he washes his feet after he washes his body. Like, why would someone do that?
Why to go to all that trouble?
So, I mean, and someone could come along later and say, other Orientals would say, oh, well, this is because, in the Jewish tradition, this was an issue. I'm not saying that's the case, but they might say something like that. But there's all sorts of things in the life of the Prophet that are just not an issue for anybody. It's, like, do you say the Iqama if you're doing like a traveling prayer? Or do you say the Iqama if you're doing like a prayer during an eclipse? Like this stuff is just this is not an issue for anybody. So why are they making this stuff up? Like, I mean, the Prophet had to say something, right? He didn't just sit there for 23 years and not say anything. And if they're so concerned about Jewish debates and about sacred law and all this, then Like maybe the prophet said some stuff about those issues. Okay, but for Goldaher, he's really looked at the metans of hadith. He says that if you look at a hadith like, that the prophet said that there's 3 mosques, you should only take your saddles off. You should only make trips to 3 mosques: the mosque in Mecca, the mosque in Medina, and the mosque in Jerusalem. He says, okay, this is made up during the Second Civil War by the Umayyads because they, the Zubayrids, Abdullah bin Zubair and his people are in control of Mecca. And the Umayyads are like, well, we want to have control of we want to have our own mosque that people come and visit. Okay, but also the Quran talks about al-Masjid al-Aqsa, right? I mean, Jerusalem is the first direction of prayer. So it's not crazy to think that Muslims actually just venerated Jerusalem. And he says, well, the Umayyad, when there's this story that the Prophet ﷺ gives like more divisions of spoils to the Quraysh than to the Benu Hashim than to the Benu Umayyah. This was made up by the Abbasids later on because the Abbasids from the Benu Hashim, and they want to make themselves look good and the Benu Umayyah look bad. And you're like, okay, but also the Benu Hashim is the Prophet's clan, right? Who are, the ones who are still alive by the time that, at that point in the Prophet's life, were all like supporters of Islam, early converts to Islam. And the Banu Umayyah are like just converted to Islam and were just the day before the chief enemies of Islam. So is that really that crazy, a thing to do? Like, so the things he claims could be true, but they're certainly by no stretch of the imagination the only reasonable explanation. But again, it's about an attitude of suspicion towards narratives, so towards Orthodox narratives. The official version of a religion can't be true because religions aren't born, they grow, and their later growths are not the original message. The next kind of generation of Orientalists is a German scholar named Joseph Schacht, who later comes to work in the US after World War II. And he basically takes Goldaher's ideas and applies it to the isnad of the hadith, as opposed to just the metan. Okay. This is Schacht's. You may recognize this chart from the hadith book. But he has this idea of the common link, right? So what he says is, if you look at, let's say, hadith collections like the 6 books, you'll see that hadith will go to the companion, successor, or let's say, and then there'll be this guy he calls the common link. And after that, it spreads out. So what he says is basically, this stuff all historically actually happened. This guy actually historically existed because we have lots of people who met them and heard this hadith from them. But he says this guy, the common link, basically invented this part of the isnad back to the Prophet in order to take his opinion and make it seem legitimate. So imagine this. Jonathan Brown is debating, which the best James Bond movie is, or who the best James Bond is. I could say I think George Lazenby is the best James Bond, but it's going to be a lot better if I say Ian Fleming said that George Lazenby was the best. So I go and I kind of attribute this opinion to George Lazenby, to Ian Fleming, sorry. Now, what's his evidence, right? So he says, if you look at, let's say, the Muwatta of Malik, we talked about the Muwatta of Malik, right? Malik dies 179, 795. The hadith, the report is just a successor. Let's say it's like Nafi', the free man of Ibn Omar and the teacher of Malik. He says, let's think of an example. Allahumma salli Muhammad. That the Prophet, shortened his prayer when he traveled to a certain place. Now, then you look in the so of Malik's student, Shafi, and you see now the hadith is attributed to a companion. So now it's not Nafi' saying this, it's, let's say, Ibn Omar saying this. And then you go to Bukhari's Sahih, and lo and behold, now it's Malik narrates from Nafi', from Ibn Omar, from the Prophet Muhammad. So he says the isnad has grown backwards. That as you move on through generations, 1, 2, 3 generations, each generation is pushing it back further to give more authority to their transmitter, to their claim. And so historically speaking, the most historically reliable report, the report that actually happened, is this one, the successor. That's what actually happened. Nafi' said this. And later on, it was attributed to the Prophet. So if you come across a report where a successor says something versus the Prophet's one is made up, and the successor's one is probably reliable, or more likely to be reliable. Another scholar who's Dutch named G.H.J. Joinbol, who died, I think, in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, he further develops this theory of the common link, right? What he says is that he kind of looks at a lot more books than Shach looked at, a lot more hadith books. Again, this person here, the successor, is the one who actually made up the hadith and then attributed it backwards to the Prophet. So what he would say is that this guy, the common link, is the link who made it up. But that later on, some scholars might like invent, he calls these dive isnad, that someone goes and invents these, this chain of transmission and makes it up. He says this has no historical reliability at all, because unlike the common link, you don't have like several people who claim to have heard it from this guy. This is just totally manufactured. That's his argument. Okay. The next stage, or some of this is kind of contemporaneous. So basically, sort of after Shah comes a series of scholars who are either Muslim or some of them are Middle Eastern but not Muslim. One of them is Nabia Abbott. She died in the 1980s. She was a professor at University of Chicago. Her name is originally Nabiha Aboud. She's an Iraqi Christian, but she was kind of really critical of some of the Orientalist approaches. And what she says is that if you go back and you look at some of the very earliest Arabic papyrus fragments we have of things like the Muwatta, that we see kind of an explanation for these things, right? So someone like Schacht would say that, in the early hadith collections, you only have, let's say, a couple of dozen hadiths from Ibn Abbas, narrated by Ibn Abbas. Then you look in later books like the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and you have so many hadiths. One of the things she says is it's not necessarily that you have a lot more hadiths, you just have a lot more narrations of the same hadith, different versions of the same hadith. And part of this is understood through, we talked about this earlier, changes in technology. Once you get paper in the 790s, you can actually afford to write down 7, 8, 9, 10 versions of the same hadith that you couldn't write down before because writing material was rare and expensive when you're writing on papyrus. We also talked about this, and she also makes a note of this, which is that Muslim scholars treated different material with different levels of critical rigor. Some material they just sort of wrote down and accepted and didn't really criticize very much. Another material that had to do with law, for example, they were very critical of. So you can't, just because some stuff is sort of multiplying uncritically doesn't mean that Muslims aren't able and capable and, in fact, employing critical methods on other topics. A great Indian scholar who just died, rahimahullah, recently, Muhammad Mustafa al-Azami, an Indian scholar who later worked in Saudi Arabia. He shows some really interesting examples. He says, Goldshair comes and gives us these examples of some guy who says, I forged this hadith because I really wanted to make the Abbasid Caliph happy because he really liked pigeons and birds. And so I made up a hadith about the Prophet said you were allowed to raise pigeons. And Azmi says, yeah, that's a story is true, but the place you find that story is in books of forged hadiths where Muslim scholars are saying, here are the reasons people forge hadiths. One of them is to make politicians happy or make rulers happy. Here's an example. So the things that Goldziher was trotting out as like, you know, Muslims, like, look what they did. These are taken from books where Muslims are saying, like, look, this guy got caught. This is an example of what we're looking for. So Goldziher is treating them as the rule. They're really maybe the exception. Or at least we have no reason to think they're the rule, no evidence to think they're the rule. He also points out that Schacht would only look at a couple of different books, and we'll see later on why that's important. If you look at a lot more books, you get a lot different conclusion. And this is also developed later by another scholar named Harold Motzke, who just died a few years ago, which is that this argument out from silence, the argument e silencio, and if we go back, you'll see what that is, right? This idea that this guy, the successor, made up the report. Why? Because look at all these people who transmit from him. We know this guy said this because there's a bunch of people who I heard this guy report this. But before him, we don't have any other evidence. Just because only one person passes on material from you doesn't mean you never said that, right? Think about this class. I could be talking to 50 students right now. How many of you are going to go and pass this on to someone else, right? And let's say one of you does, right? And then he writes down the lecture notes, and then they pass that on to someone else, right? We may, in 100 years, we might have a chain of transmission of this lecture notes from one person to one person to another person, just because, you know, once people know where to find these lecture notes, they all know to go to that one person, and that becomes the source, right? But imagine that doesn't mean that this lecture never happened. It just means that the other 59 students didn't go on and become authors who decided to pass material on, right? Especially since in that early period, people are not professional scholars. You know, they're just like people who want to learn about their religion. And it's really around the time that you start having massive branching off that you get like professional, kind of a beginning of a real self-identifying scholarly class. Okay. Another really important thing we find out, right, is that not necessarily that isnads grow backwards, but that Muslim scholars start picking out which isnads they want to keep. So this is the phenomenon of what's called parallel isnads. So what Schacht would say is, he'd say, look, this guy is the one who originally said the report, and then it gets projected backwards. Actually, what really happens, if we go and look at other books, like let's say Daraqutni's Kitab al-Adl, Daraqutni dies in 995 of the Common Era. Actually, they preserve lots of different versions. Like they might preserve a successor version, a companion version, Zuhri saying it, and the Prophet saying it. But then what ends up happening in the end is the one they choose to keep is the prophetic version. Why? Because there's no point in having the others. So imagine this. Imagine I tell you, someone comes and says, Professor Brown, give me some advice. I'll tell you, look, and this is real advice. Make sure you're wearing clean underwear because God forbid you get hit by a car and then you're not wearing clean underwear. That's advice. There you go. That seems like, it's weird advice, but that seems like something somebody could say. Then imagine you come and ask me for advice and I say, okay, my mom told me, I'm going to give you advice my mom told me. My mom told me Always wear clean underwear because you never know, you're going to get hit by a car. God forbid you're not wearing clean underwear. That person goes off. I decide I'm going to quote my mom because I'm feeling particularly emotional about my mom. And my mom told me that. Literally, she actually told me that. Then another guy comes and says, Professor Brown, give me advice. And I say, okay, listen, my mom told me that her mother told her, my grandmother, Elizabeth Patterson, told her, always wear clean underwear because God forbid you get hit by a car and it turns out you're not wearing clean underwear. All of those are true. All of those are true. Now they're all circulating out there. If you're al-Bukhari and you now have access to all these different reports, which one are you going to keep? I mean, Jonathan Brown's great, but his opinion isn't that terrific. Ellen Brown, his mom, is great, but I want the real authority in the family, the grandmother. So you keep that version. And it's only if you look at other books like the Musannaf of Abdurrazzaq Sanani, the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, these early books, or later books like Dar al-Qutni's Ilal, which brings together all this material that was floating around but that you don't find in the major hadith collections, then you see that actually the isnads are not growing backwards. You're just picking out the ones that go back to the Prophet instead of the companion versions or the successor versions. Everybody with me?
So since we have access to all this information, and like presumably, obviously the Muslims did too, why is it that like the Orientalists didn't come to the same conclusions? Like, were they just being intentionally obtuse because they had a particular agenda?
Okay.
Arabic.
Yeah. I think that the real reason is that they didn't look at a huge range of sources. I mean, I think there are certain biases, obviously, but I'll move on to this last slide because we don't have that much time, and it'll answer your question, right? The main reason is it's people like this one scholar, German scholar named Harold Motzky, is really the one who's not Muslim, right? He says very clearly, like, I don't necessarily believe in hadiths. Like, he says I have no commitment to believing hadiths or thinking the Prophet said this. But what he points out is that, I mean, so it's not necessarily that if you're not Muslim that you kind of have a bias. He just sees the real problems in a lot of these assumptions, the assumptions of the arrogance and the assumption of conspiracy, right? That religion always has to be, that scripture always has to be this big conspiracy that's developed over time. He says that blinds you to really kind of common sense possibilities, right? So one of the things he says is that, I mean, he doesn't necessarily say this, but other people say this, because some scholars go even further. People like Patricia Crona, the late Patricia Crona, I think she died in 2016, that, basically, all hadith should be assumed to be false. That, in fact, like early Islamic history is completely different, that, this idea, now she doesn't say this, but this idea that, Islam begins in Petra, that kind of stuff, completely saying that no Muslim narrative about their own history can be trusted because Muslims are biased. Well, guess what? Western scholars are also biased, right? If Islamic history is really made up, if Islam really started in Petra or something like that, who's making up this conspiracy? Remember, the Muslims are fighting, they fight 3 civil wars in the first 130 years of Islam. And, during the same time, they're spreading from Spain to India and fighting each other every 10 minutes. So who's the one who's coming up with this conspiracy and who's running it? I mean, that's harder to believe than just that, like, there's this guy named Muhammad and he lives in 7th century Arabia and he has this thing he says is the Revelation, it's the Quran. It's pretty much the same intact as it was at that time, right? And Muslims trace all the different recitations of it. That's not, okay, you don't have to believe it's Revelation if you don't feel like it, but you're going to come and tell me that I should believe it comes from the 800s or from the 500s or something like that. That's much harder to believe than just this simple Muslim narrative, which actually isn't that bizarre. Another thing Mosky points out is that they just failed to look at the breadth of tradition. So remember this example we talked about earlier. This is the Aisha age hadith. Think about that, those charts, those of I showed you of Schacht and Joinbels, and then look at this. Look at the number of chains of transmission. And by the way, there's more I found that aren't even included on here, right? These go back in what Mosky points out is, if you look at, this is what he calls isnad cum metanis analysis, right? If you can show that all these different narrations, all these different versions of Aisha's report, they pretty much have the same content. But each different version, its wording, is consistent with a certain chain of transmission. So the yellow metin is always going to go along the yellow path. The purple metin is always going to go along the purple path. The black metin is always going to go along the black path, right? You don't find the black metin going along the yellow path or the red metin going along the purple path. So actually, it seems like there is a pretty good relationship between the text, different versions of the text, and the different narration. They're consistent with what you'd find with like a dispersing narration with little variations between them. Then if you can trace these things back, if you actually go and look at all these different sources, you see the common link isn't Hisham ibn Urwa, for example, in Kufa in the 700s. It maybe is Urwa bin Zubair, right? Because this is actually one of the earliest surviving versions of Abdul Razak Sanani from the early 700s. You could even trace it back to, let's say, Urwa bin Zubair, who's the nephew of Aisha, and probably, even with all these different common links, trace it even back to Aisha herself. So that this report was circulating in the decade, let's say, the 680s, 690s, so a little bit after the time of Aisha's death. And if you're pushing it back to the time around of Aisha's death, it's pretty possible that it seems pretty likely that she actually said this. The report was floating around the time she died. And then you ask, as the gentleman asked earlier, what agenda is Aisha promoting? Like, whose agenda is she? You know, the Umayyads have like some political claim that hinges on somebody getting married when they're 9. The Abbasids have some, nobody has any interest in this, circulating this report. So it's probably just something that actually got said. He points out that problem of the argument of silence that I made earlier. And by the way, right, we talked about this earlier, which is that earlier in the semester, like when you find these early fragments of the Quran, like the Sunnah fragment, they're not telling you a different story than the Muslim version of history, right? So the bottom line is that the Muslim story for the emergence of Islam is not, you don't uncover anything, right? There's still this idea with some Western scholars that we're going to find some early version of the Quran that is just completely different and is just going to later forgery, this later orthodoxy that's been concocted by Muslims. But in fact, there is no cover-up, right? The disagreement that Muslims have over the things the Prophet said and did is there in the Hadith collections. It's there in the Sunni Hadith collections. It's there in the Shiite Hadith collections, right? It's there in Kharijite histories. It's there in lots of material. Muslims preserved all of this. They didn't hide any of it. So where is the conspiracy? And you could say, does Sunni Orthodoxy you know, sort of ignore certain early issues? Yeah, of course, because those early issues are not important, right? So the companions fought wars against each other. The companions, some of them like committed sins. You know, some of them drank alcohol. Some of them committed zina. Okay, but but Sunni scholars don't deny any of this. They just don't see a point in sitting around and like thinking about how these people who we admire, who made their best effort to do what they thought was correct in a political dispute, ended up fighting each other. And some of them were wrong and some of them were right. What's the point of focusing on that? You know, this guy who was a companion of the prophet committed a sin. Okay, guess what? Everybody commits sins. Maybe it's not actually a bad thing to keep in mind. You know, you're going to have an imam, and you know what? The imam might not be perfect. The imam of the mosque might make a mistake. Some religious leader might get caught doing something bad because no one's perfect. So, you know, there's always this search for the conspiracy, but I just don't think there is one to be found. Okay. Any questions?
I just have an announcement to make, guys. Students, though I think one student is left about the final paper. Sorry, let me do this. One student is left about the final paper. So please, inshallah ta'ala, if you can make sure that you email me the topic. The rest of you has been approved. Do remember, by the way, that the last weekend, each one of you has to summarize your paper in like 2 minutes or 2.5, maximum 3, just to tell the students. So just keep that point in mind that the Friday and Saturday of the very last day of our semester, which is going to be November sometime, each one of you that's writing the paper, obviously this is only for actual students, not the online attendees, you're going to have to summarize and present. And because time is limited, if you want to have like a slide or two, that's fine, but definitely not like 4 or 5 slides. It's literally just telling your fellow students your topic and then the conclusion that you've reached. And if there's an interesting anecdote or an interesting faida, then that would be great. And then obviously very important, as Dr. Jonathan Brown said, clean underwear, make sure, very important, okay? Alhamdulillah.
I don't know what the
Inshallah.
deal with clean underwear is. I've told the story before, but like this is some kind, I've confirmed this with other people. Like our grandparents' generation were like obsessed with this clean underwear thing.
Only those who don't have lota need to be told this. We have no need for this. Anyway, okay, inshallah, we'll see you guys, inshallah, next Monday. Jazakumullah khair. I'll send your prompt out, inshallah, by tomorrow, inshallah. Apologize for this week's prompt, but you got a week off, inshallah. Okay.
Sorry
Assalamu
about
alaikum.
that. Okay. Well,
No,
inshallah.
it's my fault. No, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah.